On the morning of February 11th, 2009, 31-year-old Paul de Gelder was conducting a routine equipment test in Sydney Harbour. As a member of the Royal Australian Navy's Clearance Diving Branch, he was trained to work around underwater explosives, confined spaces, and military threats. The harbour water around the naval base appeared calm, but beneath the surface, visibility was severely compromised. The dark green water made it difficult to read what was moving below, meaning a massive predator could remain hidden until it was already within striking distance. More than 2 decades earlier and thousands of miles away, 34-year-old speleologist Jim Pisarowicz was working in a vastly different extreme environment. He was part of an expedition mapping Mexico's Sistema Purification, a colossal underground network containing more than 55 kilometers of recorded passages. For Jim's team, reaching their underground base, known as Kama-2, required a 3-kilometer journey from the entrance. Every piece of equipment, food, and lighting had to be hauled through hours of restrictive crawls and exposed climbs in absolute darkness. For highly trained specialists like Paul and Jim, hostile environments are manageable variables. They rely on procedure and equipment to mitigate risk, but that control is fragile. In a fraction of a second, an ordinary mission can violently devolve into a fight for survival. Floating on his back near a safety boat, Paul felt a heavy impact strike the rear of his right leg. A massive gray head emerged beside his body. Despite years in the ocean, it was the first shark he had ever seen in person. The bull shark clamped its jaws around the back of his right leg and his right wrist simultaneously, locking him in place. For 8 seconds, the animal violently thrashed its head, dragging Paul beneath the surface. Unable to establish leverage to free his pinned arm, Paul could only endure the force until the shark tore away, taking his right hand and most of his hamstring with it. Deep underground, Jim's shift was ending. The team stopped near a section called the Nile to set up flashes for underground photography. As Jim moved into position, his balance shifted. He slipped, and his body instinctively threw out his right hand to break the fall. His palm struck a section of sharp, eroded flowstone. A narrow spine of mineral acted like a stone spike, punching cleanly through his glove and driving deep into the closely packed tendons and nerves of his hand. As his full weight came down, the calcite projection snapped off, remaining embedded inside. Both men now faced catastrophic physical trauma, far from medical care. Their surroundings dictated the terms of their extraction. One would have to beat the clock, while the other had to conquer the map. Released by the shark, Paul's buoyant wetsuit carried him back to the surface. As he attempted a swimming stroke, he realized the sleeve of his wetsuit ended in an empty stump. Using his left arm, he swam towards the safety boat while heavily bleeding into the harbor from his damaged leg. The 3 men in the boat pulled him from the water. Once aboard, the adrenaline that had kept Paul conscious began to fade. Extreme blood loss triggered sudden physiological failure. His eyes rolled back, prompting a teammate to deliver sharp strikes to his chest to keep his failing heart beating. The team had almost no medical supplies designed for trauma of this scale. They wrapped their shirts as improvised dressings and strapped a life jacket around his leg to create pressure. But the massive tear in his thigh was too wide for ordinary compression to stop the escaping blood. This medical cross-section illustrates the exact problem. The severed artery in his leg was rapidly draining his blood volume. Recognizing the bleeding remained uncontrolled, the team's chief made a desperate calculation. One of the men reached directly into the open wound and physically clamped the severed artery closed, using only his bare fingers. That extreme manual compression halted the massive hemorrhaging. Surgeons later confirmed that without a teammate physically pinching that major vessel shut, Paul would have bled out within 30 seconds. In the water of Sydney Harbour, distance to a hospital was less critical than the immediate rate of blood loss. Survival depended strictly on aggressive, on-the-spot human intervention to buy enough time to reach the dock. 3 kilometers inside the Mexican mountains, Jim's team faced the opposite problem. In the dim light of Camp 2, his companions used Swiss Army knives and tweezers in a futile attempt to dig out the broken stone. The fragment was buried too deeply in his hand to remove safely. Calling for a standard medical evacuation was impossible. The route back to the surface required navigating strict choke points. Narrow breakdown mazes and tight confusion tubes where a team carrying a loaded stretcher simply could not physically fit through the rock. The brutal geometry of the cave meant Jim could not be carried. To survive, he would have to endure a 3-day journey back to daylight, propelling himself through the dark with a useless, agonizing right hand. The team divided Jim's heavy survey equipment among themselves to lighten his load. For the next 3 days, Jim navigated every low crawl and vertical drop using only his legs and uninjured left hand, carefully bracing his body to prevent the embedded stone from striking the walls and severing more tissue. Deep underground, the immediate threat of rapid blood loss is entirely replaced by the relentless physical friction of the environment. Survival requires enduring an agonizing, carefully calculated logistical marathon where distance dictates the outcome. Upon reaching St. Vincent's Hospital, the full extent of Paul's injuries was assessed. The shark had destroyed a massive section of the sciatic nerve and stripped the hamstring from his leg. To prevent long-term complications from an unusable limb, surgeons amputated both his right hand and his right leg. Jim eventually emerged from the cavern under his own power. Back in Texas, surgeons successfully extracted the calcite fragment. However, the stone had severed a sensory nerve, leaving him with permanent impairment and a loss of feeling in parts of his right hand. Paul survived because a specific sequence of variables aligned perfectly. The shark released him after a single bite. His wetsuit kept him afloat. The safety boat reached him quickly, and his teammates correctly identified that standard first aid was failing. Jim's survival relied entirely on mobility and logistics. By redistributing his load and managing his wound with hot water and antibiotics, his team kept him moving, avoiding the catastrophic delay of mobilizing a massive underground rescue operation. Both incidents expose the fragility of human anatomy when exposed to the raw mechanics of the natural world. A single misplaced step on a rock or a predator arriving from the murk can permanently alter a body in a fraction of a second. While extreme environments have the capacity to inflict devastating physical trauma, the human response defines the outcome. Survival ultimately rests on the physical endurance of the victim, combined with the rapid, calculated interventions of the people around them.